Everyone in the city knew about the billionaire CEO. His name was spoken with both fear and anger, and people who worked under him often wished they had never joined his company. He had money, power, and influence, but none of it brought kindness to his heart. Instead, it made him arrogant, harsh, and ruthless. He was the kind of man who walked into a room and immediately everyone went silent, not out of respect but out of fear. His eyes carried a cold sharpness, and his words could cut deeper than any knife. In the tall glass building that carried his company's name in shining letters, employees entered each morning with nervous steps. Some prayed they wouldn't be noticed by him, because to be noticed meant to be scolded or humiliated. He had a reputation for shouting in meetings, slamming his fist on tables, and laughing at those who made even the smallest mistakes. To him, weakness was unforgivable. He believed fear was the best tool to keep people working harder. There were stories that spread like whispers in the cafeteria and office hallways. One worker once forgot to forward an email, and the CEO fired him in front of everyone. Another time, he made a young assistant cry during a presentation, mocking her voice and calling her useless. The assistant never returned. People said she moved to another city just to escape the memory. Nobody dared to question him, because he wasn't just rich. He had connections in politics, in media, in courts. People believed he was untouchable. Even outside the company, his arrogance followed him. At restaurants he insulted waiters if they were slow. At charity events he only donated money to see his face in newspapers. Not because he cared about helping anyone. Business partners often left meetings with him red-faced. Some swore they would never deal with him again. But sooner or later they always returned, because his empire was too big, and everyone feared losing their chance to earn profit. His employees, however, carried the heaviest burden. They lived in a cycle of stress. Many couldn't sleep at night thinking about the next day. Some cried quietly in bathrooms after being humiliated. But nobody had the courage to speak up, because if you dared to stand against him, your career would end. He would make sure you never worked in the industry again. The CEO enjoyed this power. It gave him a strange satisfaction to see grown men tremble and women lower their eyes when he spoke. He walked around as if he owned not just the company but also the lives of the people working for him. And in a way, he did, because their jobs, their salaries, their families depended on him. He reminded them of this often, reminding them that without him, they were nothing. He wasn't always this way. Some old workers remembered a time when he was young and ambitious, struggling to build his company. Back then, he was tough but fair. He pushed people hard but rewarded them too. However, as money poured in and his name rose on the list of the richest men, something inside him changed. He began to believe he was above everyone, that rules didn't apply to him, that he was special. Slowly, the kindness that once existed faded away, and only pride and cruelty remained. What made him more dangerous was his intelligence. He wasn't a fool. He knew how to manipulate people. He knew how to turn colleagues against one another. He knew how to make his employees compete like animals, all to keep them distracted, all to keep them from ever uniting against him. This was why nobody dared to speak, nobody dared to complain. He had built walls of fear around his empire, and he sat proudly on the throne. Journalists had tried to write about him, but their stories disappeared before reaching the public. Some believed he paid them off, others said he threatened them. There was even talk that he had friends in high places who erased anything negative about him. So the outside world only saw the surface. A successful CEO, a generous donor, a powerful figure. But those who worked close to him knew the truth. Behind the suits and smiles was a man who thrived on fear, a man who bullied everyone in his path. For years, this continued, like a storm that never ended. Workers came and left, some broken, some silent. But the cycle stayed the same, and it seemed like it would never change. Because who could possibly stand up to a man so rich, so powerful, so untouchable? People believed he would continue forever, crushing anyone who got in his way. Yet, life has its own surprises. Sometimes the strongest are brought down not by another giant, but by someone small, someone unexpected, someone who carries not power in money but power in courage. And while the CEO enjoyed his days of arrogance, humiliating everyone he pleased, a quiet figure was watching from the shadows, someone who would soon dare to do what no one else could, a maid's daughter, who refused to bow, who refused to stay silent, who refused to back down, though nobody knew it. Yet, the empire of fear was about to face its first real challenge, and it would come from the most unlikely place of all. The CEO's mansion was as grand as a palace, standing tall with shining windows. expensive cars lined in the driveway, and guards at the gates. Inside were chandeliers, marble floors, and endless rooms filled with wealth that ordinary people could not even imagine. But hidden in the corners of that grand house was a woman who carried no pride, only quiet strength. She was the maid who kept everything clean, polished, and perfect for her boss, the ruthless billionaire. She had worked there for years, waking up early every morning, ironing clothes, dusting furniture, scrubbing floors, and preparing tea exactly the way he liked it. She did her job with care, though she received no kindness in return. The CEO treated her as if she were invisible, sometimes barking orders, sometimes throwing insults, and sometimes not even looking at her as if she were less than human. Yet she stayed, because she had no choice. She needed the money. She needed to support her daughter. Her daughter was the light in her dark world, a young woman full of energy and dreams. She visited her mother often, bringing small gifts or helping with chores whenever she could. Though she disliked stepping into the mansion, because every corner of it reminded her of inequality. She saw how the CEO walked past her mother without a single thank you. She saw how guests ignored her mother as if she was part of the furniture, and it filled her heart with anger. But she hid it, because her mother always warned her to stay quiet. The maid would tell her daughter, "Keep your head down, my child. People like us cannot fight people like him. It will only bring trouble." She spoke with tired eyes. Because she had learned to swallow humiliation in silence, every insult felt like a wound. But she buried the pain deep inside, choosing to focus on her daughter's future instead. All she wanted was for her daughter to study, to live freely, and never to serve anyone the way she had to. But the daughter was different. She carried her mother's strength but also a spirit of fire. She could not watch injustice quietly. Her friends described her as bold, fearless, and honest. She never hesitated to speak the truth, even when it upset others. So when she saw the way her mother was treated, her blood boiled. How could a man with so much wealth find joy in making others feel small? How could he crush people's dignity as if it meant nothing? She often asked herself these questions. And every time, the anger inside her grew. Still, out of respect for her mother's wishes, she tried to remain calm. She smiled when she visited. She told jokes to make her mother laugh. She carried food from their small home to share, reminding her mother that love still existed outside those cold mansion walls. But deep down, she carried a promise to herself. If the day ever came when her mother suffered too much, she would no longer stay silent. She would protect her, no matter the cost. The bond between mother and daughter was unbreakable. They were not rich, but they were rich in love, in laughter, and in trust. On evenings when the maid returned home tired, her daughter would massage her hands, cook her favorite meal, and tell her about her day. They spoke of dreams, of simple hopes, of a life where they did not have to bow to anyone. The maid always smiled and said maybe one day, but her daughter's eyes carried a spark that said not maybe, but surely. The mansion staff often whispered about the maid's daughter. They noticed her fiery nature, her courage, and her refusal to lower her eyes in front of wealth. Unlike others who bowed when the CEO walked by, she stood straight, her gaze steady. It surprised many, because most people shrank under the weight of his presence. But not her. Even the security guards, who followed every order of the boss, secretly admired her bravery, though they never dared to say it out loud. One afternoon, when the daughter came to deliver lunch to her mother, she crossed paths with the CEO for the first time. He looked at her with the same arrogance he used on everyone, questioning why she was there, his tone sharp, his eyes cold. But unlike others, she did not tremble. She answered politely but firmly, her voice steady. The CEO raised his eyebrow, unused to such confidence from someone he considered beneath him. That small exchange planted something in the air, a tension, a storm, quietly waiting to break. From that day on, the CEO noticed her more, sometimes with annoyance, sometimes with curiosity. She reminded him of something he disliked, resistance. And though she never openly challenged him, her eyes spoke louder than her words. They carried a strength that unsettled him, because fear was his weapon, and here was a girl who did not seem afraid. Her mother worried constantly. She warned her daughter again and again, saying, "Please, don't draw attention. He is not a man to cross. He can destroy lives with a single word." But her daughter would simply smile and hug her, saying, "I am not afraid, Mama. You taught me to be strong, and one day, I will show him that he cannot treat people this way." The maid would fall silent after that, torn between fear and pride. The daughter's courage was not built overnight. It was shaped by years of watching her mother bend under the weight of cruelty. It was shaped by late nights when her mother cried quietly, thinking nobody could hear. It was shaped by the belief that dignity mattered more than wealth. She carried this fire inside her, waiting for the moment it would be needed. And that moment was closer than anyone thought, for in the house where power and fear ruled every corner, the maid's daughter was about to become the first crack in the walls of arrogance. The girl who seemed ordinary to the world would soon prove extraordinary, and the ruthless CEO, who believed nobody could ever stand up to him, was about to meet his match in the very daughter of the maid he had always ignored. The battle of pride and courage was only beginning. The mansion was glowing with light that evening. Important guests had gathered for one of the CEO's many social dinners. The air was filled with the sound of clinking glasses, expensive perfumes, and polite laughter. Servants rushed around carrying trays, making sure every glass stayed full and every plate was shining. The maid moved quietly in the background, her head lowered, her hands steady. She had done this countless times, making sure not to draw attention, for in that house, being noticed usually meant trouble. But on this night, her daughter was also there, helping her mother with small tasks. Though she hated stepping into that world of arrogance, she stayed, because her mother had asked for a little help, and she never refused her. The daughter walked carefully, carrying dishes, setting napkins, making sure she didn't disturb anyone. But her eyes saw everything, and her ears caught every word. The CEO at the head of the long table, laughing loudly, showing off his power, treating even his guests like children who needed to be impressed. For a while, the dinner went smoothly. The guests laughed at his jokes, even when they weren't funny. They nodded at every opinion he gave, even if it made little sense. Nobody dared to disagree, because everyone wanted to stay in his good books. Everyone wanted to remain close to his power. The daughter watched silently, disgust growing inside her. How could so many educated, wealthy people act like frightened children in front of one man? Then, it happened, a small mistake, the kind of thing that happens in every household. Her mother placed a dish on the table, but in her nervousness, the spoon slipped slightly. A drop of sauce fell on the edge of the white tablecloth. It was hardly noticeable, something that could be wiped in seconds, but the CEO noticed, and that was enough. He stopped talking, the room went quiet, his cold eyes locked onto the maid. Her mother froze, her hands trembling. The drop of sauce looked like a crime under his glare. Then, in front of all the guests, he began to scold her, his voice loud, sharp, humiliating. He called her careless, useless, and unworthy of working in his house. His words hit like stones, each one heavier than the last. The maid tried to apologize softly, but he cut her off, saying she should be grateful to even be allowed in such a place. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some lowered their eyes, some forced nervous smiles. Nobody dared to speak, nobody dared to defend the maid, because challenging the CEO meant risking his wrath, and nobody was brave enough for that. But standing at the edge of the room, holding a tray, was her daughter, her face burning with anger, her hands gripping the tray so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her heart pounded. She had seen her mother insulted before, but never like this, never so cruelly, never in front of so many people. Her mother's eyes filled with silent tears, her head bowed in shame. And that was the moment something inside the daughter snapped. The promise she had made to herself long ago returned with force. She would not stay quiet this time. She could not. Her mother had endured enough humiliation for a lifetime. She took a step forward, her voice rising in her chest. But before she could speak, her mother's eyes found hers, a silent plea, a warning, telling her not to interfere. The maid's eyes begged her daughter to let it pass, to keep the peace. But the daughter's heart was on fire, torn between respecting her mother's wish and protecting her dignity. She swallowed her words, for that moment, staying silent, but inside her, the storm was only growing stronger. The dinner continued, though the mood had shifted. The CEO laughed again as if nothing had happened. The guests followed his lead, pretending they hadn't witnessed cruelty. But the daughter's mind was no longer in the room. Her thoughts were spinning, her anger building. She replayed the insult again and again, and each time, the fire inside her burned brighter. She clenched her fists and made herself a promise, never again. She would not allow her mother to be treated like this again. Not by him, not by anyone. When the guests finally left and the house grew quiet, the maid returned to the kitchen, wiping her tears quickly before her daughter could see. But the daughter saw anyway. She placed her hands on her mother's shoulders, whispering, "You don't deserve this, Mama, nobody deserves this." Her mother tried to smile, saying softly, "It is just work, my child, let it go." But the daughter shook her head, her eyes fierce. "No, Mama, one day he will learn. One day he will know he cannot treat people this way." That night, the daughter lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind restless. She thought of all the stories she had heard, all the people her mother told her about. Employees destroyed by the CEO's arrogance, lives broken by his cruelty, and now she had seen it with her own eyes. She knew she couldn't erase her mother's pain, but she also knew she could not let the cycle continue. The spark had been lit, and there was no turning back. The next morning, the CEO entered his office, as proud and untouchable as ever, unaware that a quiet rebellion was forming, unaware that in humiliating a maid, he had awakened a force he could not control. The maid's daughter was no longer just a visitor in his mansion. She had become a silent challenger, waiting for the right moment to strike, and though he did not know it, his empire of fear had already begun to crack. That single drop of sauce, that single cruel insult, was the spark, small but powerful. It had awakened a storm carried in the heart of a daughter who refused to let her mother suffer. A storm that would soon grow into a battle between arrogance and courage, between wealth and dignity, and for the first time in years, the ruthless CEO had created not just fear, but an enemy he could not easily crush, someone who would not back down, someone who was ready to fight. Days passed after the humiliating dinner, but the memory never left the maid's daughter. She carried it with her like a wound. Every time she saw her mother's tired smile, she remembered the insult. Every time she walked past the tall mansion gates, she felt the fire inside her burn stronger. The CEO had no idea that his cruel words that evening had already sown the seeds of his own challenge, but fate soon arranged a meeting that would change everything. It was a quiet morning when the daughter came again to the mansion. Her mother had forgotten an important medicine at home, and she rushed to deliver it before her mother could grow weaker during work. The guards at the gate knew her by now. They let her in with a nod. She walked through the shining halls, carrying the small packet in her hand, her steps quick, her mind only on her mother. She didn't expect to cross paths with him, not that day, not so suddenly. But as she turned the corner of the hallway, there he was, the CEO himself, dressed in his dark suit, walking with the heavy confidence of a man who believed he owned the world. His eyes instantly noticed her, stopping her in her tracks. For a brief moment, their eyes locked, her steady and firm, his sharp and curious. He frowned, asking why she was there. His voice carried the usual arrogance, as if even her presence in the hallway was an offense. She explained calmly that she was bringing medicine for her mother, her tone respectful but not weak. The CEO smirked, tilting his head slightly, making a cruel remark, saying perhaps if her mother did her job properly, she wouldn't need someone else to rescue her. He laughed softly at his own joke, expecting her to lower her eyes like everyone else, expecting her to feel shame. But this time was different. She did not bow, she did not stutter. Instead she looked straight at him and replied, her words clear. She said that her mother worked harder than anyone in that house, that mistakes and weakness did not make someone worthless. Her voice was calm but carried a strength that filled the hallway. For a second, the CEO froze, unused to hearing such words from someone he considered beneath him, unused to being challenged, even in such a small way. The silence that followed felt heavy. A maid standing nearby dropped her eyes quickly, afraid to be caught in the tension. A guard shifted nervously, but the daughter stood still, not breaking eye contact. Her heart pounded but she refused to look away. The CEO narrowed his eyes, his smirk fading into something harder to read. There was irritation, yes, but also curiosity. He had spent years surrounded by people who feared him, obeyed him, worshipped him. Yet here was this young woman, a maid's daughter, daring to speak as if she were his equal. He chuckled finally, a cold sound, and said, "You're bold for someone so small, but boldness doesn't last long in my world." With that, he turned and walked away, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor. His words were meant to sting, but the daughter didn't feel fear. Instead, she felt stronger. She had spoken the truth, and she hadn't broken. She had faced the man who made even powerful businessmen tremble, and she had not bowed. Her mother, when she heard about the encounter later, grew pale with fear. She scolded her daughter gently, saying, "Why did you speak? Don't you know what he can do? He can destroy lives. Please don't make yourself a target." The daughter hugged her mother tightly and whispered, "Don't worry, Mama, I am not afraid. Maybe someone needs to tell him the truth. Maybe someone needs to remind him he is not God." the maid sighed, torn between pride and worry, knowing her daughter's spirit could not be tamed. In the mansion, the story began to spread quietly among the workers. Whispers moved from the kitchen to the laundry rooms. "Did you hear?" The maid's daughter spoke back to him. She looked him straight in the eyes, and he didn't fire her, he didn't punish her. The staff felt a spark of something they hadn't felt in years. Hope. Maybe the great CEO wasn't untouchable after all. Maybe he could be challenged. The CEO, however, sat in his office that afternoon, unable to forget the encounter. It bothered him more than he admitted, not because of her words, but because of her eyes, steady, fearless. It reminded him of something long buried, a time when he too had been young and bold, when he had faced men richer than him without blinking. He hated the memory, hated the reminder, and so he told himself that she was foolish, naive, and that sooner or later she would learn her place. But deep down, a small unease lingered for the daughter. That day marked a change. She realized that courage was not as impossible as people thought. Fear was the cage he had built around everyone, and the moment she refused to fear him, his power seemed smaller, his shadow less dark. She told herself that she would never back down again, not for herself, but for her mother, for every worker who had been silenced, and though she didn't know how, she felt her path was now tied to his. A battle of wills that could not be avoided. That chance encounter, short and simple, was like a spark falling on dry ground. The fire was small for now, hidden in whispers and silent hearts, but it was growing, waiting for the right moment to burst into flames. The CEO continued with his empire, unaware of how deeply that single meeting had shaken the order he had built. Unaware that the maid's daughter was no longer just another face in the crowd. She was becoming the voice that would rise against him, and fate had only just begun to weave their destinies together. The days after the hallway encounter carried a strange new energy inside the mansion. The staff whispered more boldly now, their voices soft but full of excitement. Everyone had seen or heard how the maid's daughter had spoken to the CEO without trembling. It was something they thought impossible, and the memory gave them courage. Though only in private, the CEO himself pretended it had meant nothing. He walked around with his usual pride, his head high, his voice sharp, but inside his mind, the memory of her words kept returning. The look in her eyes stayed with him like a shadow he could not shake off. For a man who thrived on fear, the thought that someone might not fear him was unacceptable. It was a small crack in the wall of power he had built, and even a small crack could spread. He told himself he needed to show her and everyone else that boldness against him had no reward, only punishment. He needed to crush that spark before it turned into fire. But how to do it in a way that satisfied his pride and reminded everyone of his authority? That question stayed with him until he found his answer. He decided to turn her courage into his game. He would make an example of her. He arranged a large public event at one of his company's headquarters. It was meant to celebrate another business success. Reporters would be there. Employees from every branch would attend, and of course, he would stand at the center, giving speeches and reminding everyone of his greatness. But this time, he had another plan hidden behind his smile. He would invite the maid's daughter to the event, bringing her out of the shadows and into his arena. When the invitation reached the maid and her daughter, it did not look like an invitation at all. It looked more like a command, written in cold formal words. The CEO wanted her presence. No reason was given. No explanation. The maid grew terrified. She begged her daughter not to go. She said it was a trap, a cruel trick meant to shame her. But the daughter only held her mother's hand and said gently, "Mama, if I refuse, he wins. If I go, at least I can show him that we are not afraid." The day of the event arrived. The hall was decorated with banners, lights, and rows of seats filled with employees and guests. Cameras stood ready to capture every moment. The CEO walked onto the stage like a king arriving in his court. His voice echoed across the hall as he spoke of his victories, his clever deals, his unmatched success. The crowd clapped because they had to, not because they wanted to, and then, with a sly smile, he called her forward. The maid's daughter, his voice carrying her name as if it were a challenge thrown in front of everyone. The crowd turned to look, whispers filled the air. Why was she here? What did he want from her? The daughter rose slowly, her heart beating fast, but her step steady. She walked through the hall, every eye on her, her mother watching from the back with tears of fear. The CEO's smirk widened as he watched her climb onto the stage. He believed he had already won, that she would break under the weight of so many eyes, under the sharp edge of his voice. He began with questions, casual at first, asking about her background, mocking her for being a maid's daughter, comparing her worth to the dust on his shoes. The crowd forced small laughs. Though many shifted uncomfortably, sensing the cruelty behind his tone, he leaned closer, his words turning sharper, asking if she truly believed people like her could ever stand equal to men like him. For a moment, silence filled the hall. It was the moment he expected her to lower her eyes, to shrink, to apologize, but instead, she looked at him with the same steady gaze as before. Her voice rose clear and calm. She said that dignity did not come from money, that true respect was not bought with wealth but earned with kindness. She said that her mother, though treated like nothing, worked with more honesty and strength than anyone in that hall. Her words rang out, each one slicing through the heavy air. The crowd gasped, some froze, others turned their heads to hide their smiles, because for the first time, someone had spoken aloud what many had secretly thought. The CEO's smirk faltered, his face tightening. He tried to laugh it off, calling her naive, saying she did not understand the world. But the tone of his laugh was different, thinner, weaker, and the daughter, instead of stopping, continued. She told him in front of everyone that power built on fear never lasts, that one day, people would stop bowing, and when that day came, his wealth would not protect him. The hall buzzed with whispers, employees exchanging glances, hearts beating faster. Her courage had touched something deep inside them, something they had buried under years of fear. The CEO felt it too. He felt the shift in the room. He slammed his hand on the podium, his voice rising, trying to regain control. But the harder he tried, the calmer she looked. Her presence was small but her words were big, and for the first time in years, his throne of fear did not feel so secure. Her mother wept quietly at the back of the hall, not from fear this time, but from pride, watching her daughter stand tall in the place where everyone else bent low. The CEO, realizing he could not win this battle without making himself look weaker, ended the exchange abruptly, dismissing her with a wave, trying to pretend it meant nothing, but his eyes betrayed him, filled with anger and unease. That night, the city whispered with new stories, not of the CEO's wealth or power, but of the maid's daughter who had stood before him and refused to bow. It was only the beginning, but already the challenge had been made clear. The game he thought he controlled was no longer his alone. She had entered it, and she was not afraid. The spark had grown into a flame, and soon the fire would spread. The hall was packed with people, the stage shining under bright lights, and cameras ready to capture every word. It was supposed to be the CEO's moment of glory, another grand event where he stood tall and reminded everyone of his power. But this time the air felt different. Tension hummed through the crowd, because everyone knew something unusual was about to happen. The maid's daughter was there, standing in front of him, and the world seemed to be holding its breath. The CEO began as he always did, his voice deep, his tone commanding. He cracked jokes at the expense of others, expecting laughter. He raised his chin and spoke of his greatness, expecting applause. But though the claps came, they felt weaker, thinner, as if the audience was distracted, as if their attention wasn't truly on him. His eyes narrowed, and he turned toward the girl who stood calmly, her presence small yet impossible to ignore. He smirked, deciding to turn the spotlight on her. He called her forward again, his voice sharp and mocking, asking her questions meant to humiliate, questions designed to make her falter. He asked if she thought she was smarter than him, if she believed she was stronger than the men in suits sitting at the front, if she truly imagined she could lecture a man who had built an empire worth billions. His words dripped with arrogance, his laughter filled the microphone. He expected the crowd to laugh with him, but the sound was thin, uneasy. The daughter stood still, her eyes steady, her hands calm, her voice rising clear and strong. She told him she did not need billions to know the difference between right and wrong. She told him that money could build tall towers but it could not build respect. She told him that fear could make people silent but it could never make them loyal. Her words cut through the heavy air, and for the first time, the hall filled not with forced laughter but with murmurs of agreement, whispers of courage, spreading like fire. The CEO's face tightened, his smirk fading into a hard glare. He leaned closer, trying to drown her voice with his own. He shouted that she was nothing, that her mother was nothing, that without him both of them would starve. His words sharp, cruel, designed to crush her spirit. The room grew tense. Some of the guests shifted uncomfortably, others looked away. But the daughter did not flinch. She looked straight into his eyes and answered calmly, saying that her mother's hands had built the life he lived, that every worker he crushed had carried his empire on their backs, and that no man who disrespected others could ever truly call himself powerful. Gasps filled the hall, a wave of shock spread across the faces of the employees. Nobody had ever dared to say such words to him before, and yet here was this girl, the daughter of a maid, standing tall, her voice unshaken. The CEO's pride burned, his anger boiling, but he could not silence her without exposing his weakness. The cameras were rolling, the eyes of the world were watching, and every word she spoke struck deeper than his insults ever could. The daughter's mother stood at the back, tears streaming down her face. She wanted to run forward and pull her child away, to shield her from the storm. But her legs refused to move. Her heart was torn between fear and pride. Never had she seen her daughter so fearless. Never had she felt so small and yet so proud at the same time. The moment felt like a dream she had never dared to imagine. The CEO slammed his hand on the podium, his voice rising in anger. He shouted that she would regret her words, that one day she would understand the price of crossing him. But the daughter only raised her chin higher, her voice steady as she said that the only thing she regretted was the silence of all those years, when nobody had spoken, when everyone bowed, when her mother cried in secret after being insulted. She said that silence ends today, and the hall erupted. Claps began softly, hesitant at first, then louder, then stronger, until the sound filled every corner of the room. The CEO's eyes widened, his power slipping in front of him. The crowd that once feared him was clapping for her, cheering for her words. His empire built on fear was shaking under the weight of courage. He tried to speak again, to drown the noise, but his voice was lost in the thunder of applause. The more he shouted, the smaller he seemed. The more she stood calm, the taller she appeared. It was a battle of pride and dignity, and for the first time in years, he was losing. Reporters scribbled quickly, cameras captured every moment. The story of the maid's daughter standing against the billionaire CEO was spreading even before the event ended. Outside the hall, people were already talking, already sharing the news. A movement had begun without her even realizing it. A movement sparked by her voice, by her refusal to bow. When the event finally ended, the CEO stormed off the stage, his face red with fury, his fists clenched. But the daughter remained standing, surrounded by workers who looked at her with admiration. Some whispered thank you. Some nodded with quiet smiles, and for the first time, they felt that maybe the fear was breaking. Maybe the walls around them were not as strong as they had once believed. Her mother rushed to her side, holding her tightly, her tears falling freely. She whispered that she was afraid but also proud beyond words. The daughter hugged her back, saying softly, "Mama, this is only the beginning. He cannot silence us anymore." And she was right. The showdown had shaken the empire. The ruthless CEO had faced the one thing he could not buy, could not threaten, could not crush: courage. And though he still sat on his throne of wealth, he knew deep down that it was no longer unshakable. The maid's daughter had planted a seed of defiance, and that seed was growing fast. Soon it would spread beyond the mansion, beyond the hall, beyond the company, and it would change everything. The story of the showdown spread faster than anyone could have imagined. By the next morning, whispers had left the company walls and reached the city streets. Workers carried it home to their families. Journalists wrote articles with bold headlines. And even on social media people were talking about the maid's daughter who had stood against the billionaire CEO and spoken the truth to his face. It was like a storm that no one could stop. The words of one young woman had cracked open a door that had been locked for years. Inside the company, the atmosphere changed almost overnight. Employees who once walked with their heads down now lifted their eyes a little higher. They spoke more freely in private. They smiled when they remembered the sight of her standing on the stage, unafraid. The CEO still roamed the halls with his usual glare, but it no longer carried the same weight. The fear was still there, yes, but it was weaker, thinner, because everyone had seen that he could be challenged, and that he was not untouchable. The CEO himself was furious. His pride had been wounded in front of cameras, in front of his own workers. 4 days he shouted more in meetings, fired 2 employees without reason, and stormed through his offices like a storm. But deep down he knew the damage had already been done. The story was no longer his to control. People had seen his mask slip, they had seen his weakness, and worst of all, they had seen courage standing against him. The daughter, meanwhile, became a quiet symbol of hope. She had not planned for fame. She had not thought of herself as a leader. But people now looked at her differently. Workers greeted her with respect when she passed. Some slipped her notes of thanks. Some whispered that she had given them strength. Her mother worried that this attention would put her in danger. But the daughter reminded her gently that silence was the true danger, not words. Journalists began asking for interviews, but she avoided them at first. She said she was not a celebrity. She was just a daughter who had spoken for her mother. Yet her words traveled anyway, repeated by others, retold in break rooms, shared in articles. Her courage was growing larger than her, and the CEO could feel it pressing against him from every side. One evening, as she walked home with her mother, a group of former employees stopped her on the street. Men and women who had once worked under the CEO but had left broken by his cruelty. One of them, an older man with grey hair, took her hand and said, "You gave us back our voices. We thought we were alone. But you showed us we are not." The daughter felt tears sting her eyes, realizing the weight of what she had done. Realizing that this was no longer just about her mother. It was about all of them. All the people he had crushed. The CEO tried to fight back. He called the press liars. He said the girl's words meant nothing. He reminded everyone of his wealth and power. But the harder he tried to silence the story, the louder it grew. Employees who once hid their pain now began to share their stories. Reporters dug up old records, old complaints, old scandals that had been buried under his influence. One by one, the cracks in his empire widened. The turning point became clear when even his closest partners began to question him. Businessmen who once bowed at his table now hesitated. Investors grew nervous. Politicians who smiled beside him at events now kept their distance. His empire, built on fear, was now shaking under the power of truth. For the maid's daughter, the change was both frightening and inspiring. She never wanted war, but now she was in the center of it. She could not walk away even if she tried. People were looking at her, listening to her, hoping she would keep speaking, and she felt the weight of that responsibility. But she also felt the strength of knowing she was no longer alone. Her mother, though still worried, began to see the bigger picture too. She realized her daughter's defiance had not only defended her dignity but also lit a fire for many others. She began to stand a little taller herself. She smiled more, and sometimes, when she looked at her daughter, her eyes glowed with pride instead of fear. The CEO, however, could not sleep peacefully anymore. Every night he replayed the event in his head, her voice echoing in his ears, her words cutting into his pride. He tried to drown it out with anger, with denial. But the truth was clear. His control was slipping, and there was nothing more terrifying to him than losing the fear that had kept him powerful for so long. This was the turning point, the moment when the balance of power began to shift. For years he had ruled like a king, unquestioned, unstoppable. But now the kingdom was trembling, not because of another billionaire, not because of a powerful rival, but because of the daughter of a maid, a young woman with no money, no title, no influence, only courage. And in that courage lay the greatest danger to his empire, because fear can silence many voices. But once a single voice rises and refuses to back down, others begin to follow, and the wall of silence crumbles, one brick at a time. He knew it. The people around him knew it. And the daughter herself knew it too. She had struck the heart of his pride, and the world was beginning to watch. The maid's daughter did not celebrate her victory. She did not boast. Instead she held her mother's hand and reminded herself that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be harder. The CEO would not fall easily. But something had changed forever. The air itself felt lighter, the fear weaker, the people braver, and the billionaire who once thought himself untouchable was now standing on shaky ground. The turning point had come, and there was no going back. The days after the turning point felt like a new season had begun. People inside the company walked with a quiet strength they had not felt in years. The fear that once hung over every office, every hallway, every desk was fading, little by little. It was being replaced by whispers of courage, by stories of the maid's daughter who had spoken the truth without trembling. For the first time, workers felt they had something stronger than fear. They had hope. The CEO still sat in his tall glass office, still surrounded by wealth and power, but he no longer walked with the same unshakable pride. Every meeting felt different now. Every speech carried hesitation. He could feel eyes on him, not with respect, but with judgment. Where once his words made men tremble, now they made them question. Where once his laughter silenced rooms, now it echoed awkwardly, empty and forced. He had not yet fallen, but he had been shaken, and everyone could see it. Outside the company, the story spread even wider. News outlets ran headlines. Journalists dug deeper into his past. Workers who had once been silent came forward with their stories, one after another, their voices joining together like waves. For years he had hidden behind money and influence, but now the shield was cracking, and people no longer feared speaking against him. His empire of arrogance was slowly collapsing under the weight of truth. And in the center of it all was the maid's daughter. Though she never asked for it, she became a symbol. People began to invite her to speak. Students asked her to visit their schools. Organizations wanted her voice. But she never saw herself as a hero. She always said the same thing. I am just a daughter who refused to see her mother humiliated. I only did what anyone should do. And yet her humility made her story even stronger. People saw her not as a politician or a leader, but as one of their own. Someone ordinary who showed extraordinary courage. Her mother, once so afraid, now held her head higher. When she walked through the mansion halls, she no longer bent her shoulders, no longer lowered her gaze. She still worked, still did her duties. But now she carried pride in her heart, because her daughter had given her dignity back. Every time she saw her daughter's name in the papers, or heard people whisper with respect, tears filled her eyes, not tears of shame, but tears of pride. The CEO tried to fight. He used his lawyers, he used his money, he tried to scare those who spoke against him. But it no longer worked. Fear had lost its grip, and once fear is gone, power begins to fade. He shouted louder, but his voice carried less weight. He threatened stronger, but people no longer bowed. He had built an empire on silence, and now silence was broken. His downfall was slow but certain. The daughter, meanwhile, learned that courage came with responsibility. She faced criticism. She faced doubt. Some called her reckless. Some said she was lucky. But none of it mattered, because she knew she had done what was right. She knew she had spoken not only for her mother but for every person crushed by arrogance, and that knowledge gave her strength. One evening, as the sun set over the city, painting the sky with orange and gold, the maid and her daughter sat together outside their small home. The mother's hands resting gently on her daughter's, they spoke softly, not about fear, not about humiliation, but about dreams. The mother whispered, I never thought I would live to see this day, the day when I could walk with dignity, the day when my daughter would teach the world courage. The daughter smiled, her eyes shining, and said, Mama, this is only the beginning. And it was true. The story did not end with the CEO's anger, nor with his fading empire. The story lived on in every worker who found the courage to speak, in every family who realized that dignity was worth more than money, in every young girl who saw that even the smallest voice could challenge the loudest power. It was a new dawn, not just for one maid or her daughter, but for everyone who had ever bowed their head in silence. The CEO would be remembered, yes, but not as he wanted, not as a man of greatness, but as a man who fell because of his pride, because he underestimated the strength of one ordinary voice. The daughter, however, would be remembered for something greater, not for wealth, not for titles, but for courage, for the fire she carried in her heart, for proving that true power lies not in money, but in standing for what is right. And so, the mansion that once stood as a symbol of fear now stood as a reminder of change. People would point to it and say, that is where it began. That is where a maid's daughter refused to bow, and from there, the world began to shift. The sun rose brighter, the air felt lighter, and the city carried a new story in its heart. The story of courage against cruelty, the story of dignity against pride, the story of a maid's daughter who refused to back down. The new dawn had come, and with it, the lesson that no empire of fear lasts forever, and no voice is ever too small to make the world listen.